Official statements are falling like veils, concealing more than they reveal. Allegations swirl like a gathering storm. Whispers of confusion, suspicion, and spiritual unrest echo through marble corridors. As the world turns its gaze toward Rome, hoping for signs of unity and sacred renewal, something far more turbulent is taking place beneath the surface. These are not ordinary hours, they are moments of intensity, of decision, of spiritual consequence. And they will not soon be forgotten. While millions pray in silence and faithful hearts beat with expectation, what unfolds now in the heart of the Eternal City may shape not only the name of the next pope, but the very direction of the Catholic Church for generations to come. Behind the majestic domes and solemn chants, an invisible struggle is unfolding, a conflict not fought with weapons or shouts, but with influence, silence, secrecy, and guarded intent. The conclave has not yet begun, but already the battle lines are drawn, not of enemies, but of visions. Not of factions, but of convictions. The atmosphere, cloaked in liturgical solemnity, is anything but peaceful. Within the sacred halls, uncertainty pulses just beneath the surface. Rumors circulate like incense in tight spaces. Sudden health scares, unexpected absences, whispered exclusions. Accusations once uttered only behind closed doors now swirl in media speculation. Some speak of doctrinal concerns. Others point to power dynamics rarely visible to the outside world. In this charged environment, even the air feels heavy, as though waiting for a thunderclap that hasn't yet come. At the center of this growing intrigue is Cardinal Oralion, a figure many have long considered a leading voice for continuity after the end of Pope Francis's era. But it is not his theological insight or pastoral record that has drawn headlines in recent days. Instead, the spotlight has fallen on his unexpected collapse, following a session of the General Gathering on April 30th. Some sources close to the inner circles describe it as a simple episode of physical fatigue, a drop in blood pressure, nothing more. Others off the record speak of something more serious, perhaps a moment of spiritual or emotional breaking under immense pressure. The Vatican's official response has been swift and terse. Matteo Russo, the press coordinator for the Holy See, addressed the reports with a tone as dry as it was dismissive. "There is no truth to these claims," he stated bluntly, brushing aside questions with the elegance of formality and the firmness of command. But his words raised more questions than they settled. To many observers, his manner didn't sound like clarity. It felt like containment. As if something needed to be kept beneath the surface, hidden perhaps, to preserve the delicate balance of the moment. Cardinal Oralion is not a peripheral figure. His name has long been tied to some of the Church's most sensitive diplomatic efforts. He is a man familiar with compromise, with delicate negotiations, with walking the line between openness and control. His supporters see him as a skilled steward of the Church's complex position in a fragmented world. His critics, however, have long accused him of sacrificing internal integrity for the sake of diplomatic calm. And in that tension lies the deeper question. Can a church that seeks to be both universal and prophetic continue to walk this tightrope without losing its soul? He is not just a prominent figure within the church, he is its silent strategist. Cardinal Oralion, whose name now floats across headlines and hushed conversations alike, has long stood behind decisions that have altered the spiritual rhythm of Catholic life. Though rarely in front of cameras, his influence runs deep. He was the quiet force behind the sweeping changes to the liturgy, guiding, signing, and standing behind the documents that redefined access to ancient rites. To many, he is the architect of a new era. To others, he is the man who placed a seal on centuries of sacred tradition. Among his most notable and contested actions was his endorsement of the Interfaith Declaration from Abu Dhabi, a document that spoke of unity and mutual understanding between religions. It carried a message of peace, yes, but also a phrase that troubled many: that God willed the diversity of religions. Supporters praised the initiative as a bold step toward dialogue in a fractured world. Critics, however, struggled with the theological implications, wondering whether truth, once declared eternal, could now be plural. In this climate, where every word is dissected and every gesture scrutinized, it is no surprise that Cardinal Oralion would seek to appear steady, unshaken, invulnerable. The weight of history rests on his shoulders. The ring of the fisherman, still warm from the previous pontificate, seems to cast a shadow over every move he makes. In these fragile hours, even the faintest sign of weakness could reshape the narrative and change the tide of succession. And then, as if summoned by the moment itself, the calm is pierced. The voice that many hoped had faded into obscurity returns loud, deliberate, and defiantly unfiltered. Archbishop Emeritus Ciro Mariano Vescari, a man known as much for his convictions as for his isolation, emerges once again into public view. For years he has spoken from the margins, offering fiery critiques of what he sees as compromises within the Church. But now, in this charged atmosphere, his words land like thunder. He does not simply raise questions about the conclave. He challenges its very legitimacy. With unwavering boldness, he claims that the gathering of cardinals to elect the next successor to Peter is not just flawed, it is invalid. He speaks not with the nuance of a scholar, but with the force of a prophet crying out in the wilderness. His message is not wrapped in diplomacy. It is sharp, direct, and unapologetically divisive. For many, his remarks are troubling. For others, they are a needed jolt, an uncomfortable truth long whispered, now shouted. Whatever the response, one thing is certain. The idea that this conclave is merely a smooth continuation of administration has shattered. What once felt like routine now feels like rupture. In a statement that shook even those accustomed to controversy, Archbishop Vescari did not stop at questioning the conclave's structure. He launched a bold and far-reaching assertion, one that reached to the very heart of the Church's authority. In his eyes, a significant portion of the College of Cardinals no longer holds moral or spiritual legitimacy. According to his argument, many of those who will soon cast votes for the next pope were elevated by a pontiff he publicly regards as having deviated from the truth of the faith, a leader he accuses of holding and promoting ideas incompatible with sacred tradition. Therefore, Vescari argues, if the one who appointed them lacks legitimacy, then so too do those appointments. In his view, the electors themselves are not truly cardinals, but placeholders in a structure built on sand. This dramatic claim might have remained a fringe opinion were it not for the support it received from an unlikely source. Standing beside him, not physically but intellectually, is one of the most respected philosophical voices of recent Catholic thought. Professor Joseph Cyran, a scholar once admired by Pope John Paul II himself. Known for his decades of theological depth and unwavering commitment to orthodoxy, Cyran brings both academic credibility and spiritual weight to the conversation. His words carry not the tone of rebellion, but the solemnity of a man deeply grieved by what he sees unfolding. Cyran has called for something unprecedented: a formal canonical investigation into the current composition of the College of Cardinals before the conclave begins. He believes it is not only reasonable but necessary to determine whether a significant number, perhaps even 2/3 of the voting cardinals, should be declared ineligible due to what he describes as persistent deviation from fundamental Catholic doctrine. His position is not grounded in gossip or rumor. He cites speeches, writings, and decisions that, in his view, point toward a departure from what the Church has always held as true. He warns that proceeding with a conclave under such circumstances would not only cast a shadow on the outcome, it could damage the credibility of even the most devout and sincere future pope. In his words, to entrust the keys of Peter to a process already compromised is to place the purity of the office in jeopardy. But the storm doesn't stop there. Archbishop Vescari takes things a step further, naming names in a move that stunned even his most ardent supporters. Without hesitation, he directs public accusations at two prominent figures within the Vatican's current leadership. The first is Edgard Pinero, a powerful and discreet voice said to wield significant influence behind the scenes. The second is Cardinal Kevin Farron, whose position at the helm of key Vatican departments places him near the center of power. Vescari's charges are grave. He accuses both men of involvement in acts of corruption, of participating in networks of coercion and manipulation, and of bearing indirect responsibility for covering up past scandals that have haunted the Church, particularly those tied to the late former Cardinal Theodore M. McCarran. While the Vatican has issued no direct reply to these claims, The mere mention of these names in such a context reignites painful memories for many Catholics who still seek justice and transparency in the wake of past failures. These are no longer abstract debates about doctrine or governance. They are deeply human matters, questions of integrity, truth, and accountability, and they strike at the heart of the Church's moral witness. In just a few days, the cardinals will enter the Sistine Chapel, placing their votes beneath Michelangelo's Last Judgment. But long before any smoke rises, the soul of the Church is already on trial in the hearts of her faithful, in the voices of her prophets, and in the silence of her decision-makers. While tensions mount and the Catholic world finds itself pulled between scandal and silence, a man cast to the edges of the Church's inner circle continues to speak. Some dismiss him. Others revere him. But no one can ignore him. Archbishop Vescari, now living in quiet exile, recounts what he calls his own form of modern martyrdom, not with bitterness, but with the solemnity of one who believes his suffering has meaning beyond himself. On the very day he reached the canonical retirement age of 75, he was not honored, but exiled. A voice once welcomed in sacred halls was silenced with bureaucratic precision. His citizenship within the Vatican city-state was revoked. His passport confiscated. His driver's license invalidated. All stripped away in a sweep that felt more like punishment than protocol. Not even those who broke from the Church during ancient schisms, he once said, were cast aside with such icy thoroughness. And yet, he remains undeterred. Though removed from the corridors of Rome, Vescari has not abandoned his voice. He speaks not for recognition, but from conviction. With unrelenting intensity, he continues to issue warnings that many wish would simply fade away. He accuses the highest authorities of guiding the Church into dangerous waters, of dissolving the firm ground of doctrine into a fluid, shifting structure without boundaries. In his words, the Church has become a vessel without compass, where every deviation is tolerated except for the tradition that once gave it direction. He believes this transformation has not occurred by accident. To him, it is a deliberate dismantling of theological clarity. A deconstruction of spiritual identity masked as progress. And while his tone may be incendiary to some, his central question resonates with others. Can a faith built on timeless truths survive if those truths are treated as negotiable? Within this storm of voices, the Vatican's official press office has moved to reframe the narrative with urgency. Their message is clear. This is not a political campaign. This is not a contest between ideological wings. It is not a battleground for progressives and conservatives. It is, they insist, a sacred moment beyond media headlines, beyond secular simplifications. A moment guided not by platforms or programs, but by prayer and discernment. To reinforce this point, they look back to previous conclaves. In 2005, when the Church mourned the death of Pope John Paul II, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger did not seek the papacy. In fact, he prayed not to be chosen. In his own words, the weight of the office felt less like an honor and more like the fall of a guillotine, a symbol of sacrifice, not ambition. And in 2013, when Pope Francis emerged from the conclave, it was not the result of a crafted campaign or long-held agenda. It was, according to witnesses, the result of a spontaneous address, a short, heartfelt reflection that unexpectedly struck the hearts of his fellow cardinals. The Vatican reminds the world. The true work of a conclave takes place not in the eyes of cameras or under the scrutiny of headlines, but in the hearts of men kneeling in prayer. There are no campaign trails, no election posters, no televised debates. The process is cloaked in silence so that something higher can be heard. But outside those guarded walls, the noise only grows. But this sacred and contemplative view, the one rooted in prayer, silence, and spiritual weight, holds little appeal for the machinery of modern media. The deeper meanings, the genuine reverence behind the conclave, are often bypassed for simpler, more sensational headlines. Many news outlets reduce the process to political spectacle, casting it in the language of campaigns, rivalries, and intrigue. What is sacred becomes distorted by worldly filters. What is meant to be solemn becomes portrayed as strategic. And so, the Holy See, through its official voices and measured statements, continues the slow, careful work of correcting misconceptions. Vatican spokespeople remind the world that the general congregations preceding the conclave are not political arenas or places for hidden bargaining. These meetings are not stages for maneuvering, but rooms for reflection, spaces where the Church's most urgent wounds are examined honestly and where paths forward are discussed in humility. In these assemblies, the cardinals speak about the real challenges that threaten the soul of the Church. The conversation turns to secularization, a slow, creeping erosion of faith in once thriving Christian communities. They speak of vocations of seminaries once full, now echoing with absence. They discuss the deep need for spiritual renewal in an age of distraction and despair. And yes, they also talk of numbers, financial health, institutional sustainability, concrete facts. Cardinal Marcus, one of the most experienced voices in church governance, reported a €7 million deficit. The Vatican's financial entities presented detailed updates, attempting transparency in a world that often demands it without listening. But these sobering realities rarely make the news. The crisis of faith, after all, doesn't generate as many clicks as the illusion of conspiracy. For much of the outside world, talk of faith is too quiet, too patient, too inconvenient. Power struggles sell better than prayerful discernment. Still, as more reports surface, some based in fact, others in interpretation, new questions begin to rise, slowly but steadily. In certain corners of Catholic discourse, the tone remains measured, but the implications are sharp. One question, spoken carefully yet unmistakably, begins to echo. Will the next conclave give the Church a pope in the spirit of Peter, or a man chosen for other reasons entirely? It sounds, at first, like provocation. A bold, perhaps even inappropriate suggestion. Yet it's not shouted from street corners. It is posed in the thoughtful setting of a widely followed program on faith and theology. There, the hosts raise a delicate alarm, that the conclave might elevate not a man of prayer, but a figure molded by the powers of this world. Such concerns gain traction as certain figures rise in prominence. Cardinal Oralion, for instance, one of the most mentioned names in recent days, is now the subject of speculative portrayals that border on the mythic. In some circles, he is darkly nicknamed the Vatican Shadow, or even likened to a character from cinematic villainy. Some whisper that his rise is supported not by the body of the faithful, but by powerful individuals whose loyalties lie far beyond the Church's spiritual mission. Rumors untested and unverifiable speak of endorsements from groups with no rooted connection to Catholicism. Others point to his liturgical choices, including the recent use of Pope Francis's ceremonial mitre during a Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. For some, this was an innocent gesture. For others, it carried an air of presumption, as if rehearsing a role not yet assigned. Even Cardinal Zani's head of the National Episcopal Conference, and seen as a face of global ecclesial outreach, is not free from criticism. Once praised for his charisma and bridge-building efforts, he is now scrutinized for past associations. One such moment, often cited by critics, was his role in officiating the wedding of a well-known public figure connected to Freemasonry. 2 years later, Zanis was appointed to lead the national church hierarchy. The coincidence, to some, raises concerns. To others, it is simply irrelevant history. But in this current climate, every detail becomes loaded with meaning. Among traditional Catholics, there is growing anxiety. They see the signs and symbols stacking like uneasy omens. In their view, the Church is not merely at risk of ideological drift, it stands on the edge of consecrating ideology in place of revelation. Doctrine, they fear, is becoming a relic. The timeless is being replaced with the trendy. And voices from within this community are now speaking out with increasing urgency. Not just in defense of the Latin liturgy or historical disciplines, but in defense of truth itself, the foundational gospel truth that transcends culture, time, and trend. And all this unfolds while the world itself trembles. Outside the Church, nations reel from unstable economies, digital manipulation, unending conflicts, and the erosion of moral consensus. Green revolutions falter. Wars become normalized. Freedom of thought is increasingly controlled by algorithms. And in the midst of this worldwide disorder, many faithful begin to see a connection. The crisis of the Church is not isolated. It mirrors, and perhaps even deepens, the wider spiritual crisis engulfing humanity. it is not just a moment of institutional choice. It is a global spiritual crossroads, one where faith, truth, identity, and the very voice of God are at stake. Inside the Vatican walls, preparations for the conclave proceed with ritual precision. Candles are trimmed. Vestments are laid out. The floor of the Sistine Chapel is carefully inspected. Beneath the grandeur of frescoes and centuries-old architecture, whispers are exchanged in Latin, Italian, Spanish, and English. The ancient rhythms of the church remain incense, silence, and the quiet shuffle of cassocks. Yet behind this choreography lies a question so heavy it threatens to bend the atmosphere itself. What kind of church will emerge when the smoke rises? Outside, beyond the Bernini colonnade and the cobbled streets of Rome, the faithful wait. Some with hope, some with concern, some with hearts quietly breaking. For millions of Catholics, this conclave is not just a procedural event, it is a moment that may confirm their faith or deepen their confusion. Because for many, this moment doesn't feel like continuity, it feels like reckoning. In parishes across continents, the divide becomes more visible. In one cathedral, a bishop preaches about mercy, inclusion, and the church's call to adapt with love to the times. In another, a priest speaks with quiet urgency about the unchanging truths of the gospel, warning against losing sight of sacred tradition. Both stand before the same crucifix. Both read from the same lectionary. Both shepherd flocks hungry for direction. And yet, what they offer feels profoundly different not in intention, but in essence. Among the laity, this divergence is felt even more deeply. Families once unified in faith now find themselves split by spiritual instinct. Grandparents long for the reverence they remember kneeling, Gregorian chant, and clear moral teaching. Their grandchildren long for inclusion, belonging, and an expression of faith that answers the pain of their generation. Between them stretches not rebellion, but a canyon carved by years of theological drift and pastoral experimentation. Young seminarians, entering formation with idealism in their hearts, sometimes encounter confusion instead of clarity. Some are drawn to reverent liturgy, to the beauty of vestments and Latin prayers, finding in it the sacred mystery they thought was lost. Others seek mission on the margins, urban chaplaincies, care for migrants, work with the forgotten. They do not oppose one another, but neither do they speak the same spiritual language. Each side sees the other as missing something vital. And yet, beneath it all, they are all still trying to find Christ. This is what makes the present moment so fragile and so holy. Because this conclave is not simply about choosing a man, it is about choosing a direction. And while the Church insists there are no candidates, no campaigns, everyone knows that personalities are not neutral. The cardinals entering the Sistine Chapel are not blank slates. They are men shaped by the decades they've lived, the nations they've served, and the theological visions they carry in prayer. Some are seen as bridge builders, capable of navigating a global church with wisdom and diplomacy. Others are perceived as reformers, men who will not hesitate to challenge long-standing norms. Still others are guardians of orthodoxy, holding fast to the teachings of the fathers and the language of past councils. None of them are perfect. But one of them will soon bear a name the world will not forget. And among the cardinals themselves, there is no illusion that this will be easy. Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of reporters and faithful alike, conversations take on a different tone. In small groups, over simple meals or quiet walks in shaded gardens, words are spoken that never reach microphones. Concerns are voiced. Fears are shared. Not about scandal or division, but about discernment. Because these men, cloaked in crimson, understand something that the world sometimes forgets. The papacy is not a prize. It is a weight. A responsibility that stretches far beyond borders and timelines. And none wants to be the one to fracture what is already strained. There are those who believe the answer lies in returning to what has been lost. In reviving liturgies, restoring disciplines, and anchoring the Church once more in its timeless core. For them, clarity is not cruelty, it is love. To speak the truth without wavering, to preach without compromise, is not to exclude, but to shepherd rightly. They point to the saints who bled for doctrine, who stood alone in the face of heresy, who refused to bend when emperors and mobs demanded otherwise. But others see a different call. They believe the church must be a field hospital, as Pope Francis once described it: open, listening, healing. They see the pain of those who feel pushed away, the divorced, the poor, the marginalized, the misunderstood. For them, mercy is not the enemy of truth, it is the beginning of it. They point to Jesus bending low in the dust, writing silently beside the accused. They believe the church must learn again to weep before it teaches. The great tragedy would be to choose only one and forget the other. Because if this conclave ends with the elevation of a man who only guards without healing, the church may become a fortress with locked doors. But if it ends with a man who only welcomes without guiding, the church may become a house without foundations. The world outside is watching, but not always with reverence. Many wait with skepticism, convinced the conclave is just another ritual from a world fading into irrelevance. But they miss something sacred. This process, for all its human frailty, remains one of the last moments on earth where leaders are chosen not for wealth or popularity, but for prayer, for listening, for sacrifice. And perhaps that is the miracle, that in an age obsessed with speed, power, and visibility, the most influential decision in the Catholic Church still begins in silence. Still begins in the heart of men who kneel. As the bells of St. Peter's continue to toll, as the candles flicker in unseen chapels, as rosaries pass through fingers in distant lands, the body of Christ waits not just for a name, but for a sign. A sign that despite the fractures, the weariness, the fear, the Spirit has not left. And when the doors of the Sistine Chapel finally close, the world will hold its breath. But heaven will already know the answer. As the hours pass and the shadows lengthen beneath the dome of St. Peter's, the city of Rome holds a breath that seems shared across the world. Tourists wander the piazzas with curiosity, vendors arrange rosaries and crucifixes with practiced ease, and pilgrims gather with quiet devotion, unaware that behind guarded doors, a spiritual crossroads draws ever closer. The Vatican may appear still, wrapped in ritual, but within, something ancient stirs, a sacred waiting, centuries old, now unfolding once more. In the silence of their rooms, the cardinals pray. They do not sleep easily. These are not ordinary days, and they know it. Some look over notes they've written in private, reflections on the church's needs. Others walk the gardens, beads in hand, whispering the rosary as the moonlight filters through trees planted by saints and popes long gone. This moment, heavy and holy, does not call for brilliance, but for surrender. They have each been called not to assert their preferences, but to listen to one another, yes, but even more so to the quiet voice that speaks beyond ambition or strategy. And yet, even in such solemnity, uncertainty lingers. The world has changed. The Church, too, has changed. Some ask if the conclave can still produce what it once did: a man chosen purely for the salvation of souls, not the satisfaction of sides. Because while the conclave remains unchanged in form, the world around it trembles with tension. The faithful outside long not just for leadership, but for clarity. They want to know what kind of shepherd will emerge from behind the locked doors. Will he preach Christ crucified in a language the world cannot ignore? Or will he navigate the shifting currents of modern culture with diplomatic caution? Will he call the church to return to the upper room to rediscover Pentecost fire, or will he invite her into a conversation about evolving perspectives, walking the line between ancient witness and contemporary relevance? The divide is not political, it is spiritual. And it runs deep. In Africa, where the church grows with vibrant energy and unapologetic faith, many bishops and priests call for a pope who will uphold tradition boldly. They see families strengthened by clarity. They see youth turning to the church not because it bends, but because it stands firm. For them, a strong church is a safe church. A church where truth is spoken, even when it wounds, because it heals more deeply than the world ever could. In Latin America, where poverty and suffering remain daily realities, the longing is for a leader who embodies compassion. One who doesn't speak from a throne, but from the ground. One who walks where the people walk, weeps where the people weep. A pope of the people who makes the poor feel seen, the excluded feel chosen. In Europe, where faith has grown quiet, Some cardinals seek a restorer, a man who can reawaken reverence in cold cathedrals, who can give new voice to the gospel in a post-Christian age. Others, however, feel the urgency of change. They want a voice that speaks not from the past, but to the present, a teacher fluent in today's language, even if that language is fractured. In North America, the divisions echo louder than anywhere else. Debates rage in parishes and pulpits. Some cry out for orthodoxy, others plead for reform. Every gesture from Rome is dissected, every homily weighed. The next pope will not arrive to unity, but perhaps he will be the beginning of it. And in Asia, quietly, steadily the church grows. There, amid cultural complexity and religious plurality, the faithful long for a leader who understands nuance without surrender, who can be both missionary and mystic, who knows that the gospel must be proclaimed with courage, but also with humility. This is the landscape the cardinals must carry into their prayer. They are not voting in isolation. Each brings the heartbeat of their people. Each casts a vote not just for theology or temperament, but for the very soul of the Church's next chapter. And while the world may speculate endlessly, constructing charts, identifying frontrunners, fueling narratives, the reality within the conclave is far simpler and far more sacred. They vote for the man who, in the silence, they believe can carry the weight of Peter's keys. And somewhere among them, there is one who has no idea that the burden will soon fall upon his shoulders. He may feel it already in the strange quiet around him, in the way others glance his way, then look down. He may notice his name is mentioned more often now, though never directly. He may be unable to sleep, his heart unsettled not by fear, but by the deep knowledge that God sometimes asks for what seems impossible. And still, the conclave has not begun. The Sistine Chapel stands ready. Chairs have been arranged. The ballots, printed with care, await their mark. The chimney, ancient and unassuming, will soon carry its message in smoke. Black for waiting, white for arrival. A signal older than the printing press, older than the telephone, yet known instantly across the globe. In chapels from Seoul to Sao Paulo, candles are lit. In homes in Nairobi, Krakow, Toronto, and Manila, families gather, not just to watch, but to pray. Not for their favorite candidate, not for ideology, but for God's will. For a shepherd who can kneel before the tabernacle in awe and still walk into the chaos of the modern world with courage. For a pope who will not be defined by media or movements, but by the cross. And when the doors of the conclave close, the world outside will grow louder. But inside, the church will grow still. A stillness that is sacred, that listens, that waits. And when, finally, the white smoke rises, a new chapter will begin. Not because a perfect man was chosen, but because a faithful church dared to believe again that in the midst of division, confusion, and longing, the Spirit of God still moves. And in that moment, across time zones and languages, one voice will echo not from a politician, not from a pundit, not from a press release, but from a balcony in Rome. Habemus Papam. The bells ring out not as noise, but as proclamation. From the ancient towers of St. Peter's, their song spills into the sky, reverberating through the cobblestone streets of Rome and racing outward to every corner of the earth. Habemus Papam. We have a pope. The crowd stirs. Flags wave. Hands rise instinctively to make the sign of the cross. For a brief moment, the noise of the world quiets. For one fragile instant, history pauses. A window opens. And there, standing beneath the weight of eternity, is a man who just days ago walked those very halls unseen. A man who now bears the name given not by inheritance or power, but by faith, silence, and surrender. He does not smile right away. His eyes are wide. His hands tremble slightly as he raises them, not in conquest, but in greeting. He looks out not just at the thousands below, but beyond them. To the restless, the wounded, the skeptical, the seeking. To those who left the church, but still carry a candle deep inside. To those who stayed and wondered if anyone was listening. To priests losing heart. To nuns still praying. To children asking questions no one can answer. To saints in the making. To sinners on the brink of despair. He knows the path ahead will not be smooth. He has seen the division. He has heard the bitterness. He has read the headlines. But still, he steps forward. Not because he is strong, but because grace has brought him here. And then, in a voice both unfamiliar and familiar, he speaks. Not long, not loud, but with the weight of one who knows this moment is not about him. He asks for prayer, not applause. He offers blessing, not a plan. And in doing so, he reminds the world that the Church is not defined by power, but by love. Not by popularity, but by fidelity. Not by perfection, but by presence. The crowd applauds, but the moment is not about the noise. It is about the stillness beneath it. The stillness of hearts moved by something ancient and alive. The stillness that comes when heaven touches earth, even if only for a breath. As the new pope retreats from the balcony, the world exhales. Cameras turn off. Commentators rush to interpret what just happened. But deep in the soul of the Church, something simple has occurred. A successor to Peter has been chosen. A door has opened. A journey has begun. And the question now is not just who he is, but who we are willing to become. Because the future of the Church does not rest solely on one man in white. It rests on all who believe, all who pray, all who forgive, all who hope. The conclave has ended. The decision has been made. But the real work of healing, of preaching, of rebuilding begins now. In the smallest chapels and the grandest cathedrals. In whispered prayers and bold proclamations. In the courage to carry the cross and the humility to kneel before it. The Church walks forward. Not perfectly. Not without struggle. But still forward. And perhaps that is enough.